Quincy Collins was shot down over North Vietnam on September 2, 1965. Just 13 missions into his combat tour, his F-105 Thunder Chief took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire while he was attacking a heavily defended bridge, and the next thing he knew, he was falling through the sky with a broken leg, descending toward a country that would hold him prisoner for the next 7.5 years. That's 2,721 days of captivity, nearly a decade stolen from his life. And when you hear what he went through during those years, what he endured, and what he created to survive, you start to understand what real American heroism looks like. James Quincy Collins was born on Independence Day, July 4, 1931, in Winnsboro, South Carolina. There's something almost too perfect about that. A future Air Force fighter pilot and prisoner of war born on the very day we celebrate American freedom. His family moved to Concord, North Carolina when he was young, and that's where he grew up, a small town just northeast of Charlotte. His father was in the furniture business, had stores in multiple locations, and during World War II, he joined the Civil Air Patrol. That was where Quincy first caught the flying bug, watching his father's involvement with aviation, hearing stories about the war effort, developing that sense that the sky was where the real action happened. By the time Quincy Collins finished high school in Concord, he knew he wanted to be a military man. He headed to the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the oldest military colleges in the country, established back in 1842 in the years before the Civil War. And I want to take a moment and say, if you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we try to preserve here. Stories of real American servicemen who put everything on the line. Stories that deserve to be remembered and shared. If you appreciate hearing these accounts, if you want to help keep these veterans' stories alive, consider subscribing. We put these out regularly, and your support means a lot. The Citadel wasn't just a school, it was a way of life. Strict discipline, demanding academics, military bearing from the moment you arrived until the moment you graduated. Cadets wore uniforms, marched to meals, followed rigid schedules that left little time for the casual freedoms of other college students. The idea was to produce leaders, men who could handle pressure, who understood duty, who would serve their country with distinction. Quincy thrived there. He joined the school band, auditioned as soon as he arrived, because music was already a big part of his life. He had sung in church choirs as a boy, had learned to read music and carry a tune, had discovered that something about organizing people around song spoke to his natural leadership instincts. At the Citadel, he continued that passion, participating in the musical life of the campus while also excelling in his academic and military training. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Commerce, preparing himself for a career in business if the military didn't work out. But the military was always his first choice. He also found his way to the Air Force ROTC program at the Citadel. This was during the early 1950s. The Korean War was raging, and young men like Quincy Collins knew they might be called to serve. The Air Force was the newest branch of the military, having only become independent from the Army in 1947, and it offered the most technologically advanced career path for a young man interested in aviation. Flying jets, pushing the envelope of what was possible in the air. That was the future, and Collins wanted to be part of it. When he graduated from the Citadel in 1953 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Commerce, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. Less than a month after graduation, in July of 1953, he went on active duty. His entire adult life would be shaped by what happened next. A career that would take him from the training fields of Texas to the corridors of power in Europe, from the cockpit of the most advanced fighters in the world to a prison cell in North Vietnam, Collins reported to pilot training at Laredo Air Force Base in Texas. He was tall, over 6 feet, solidly built, not the typical picture of a refined music man, but someone with an obvious love of flying and an intensity that his instructors noticed. He earned his pilot wings in August of 1954, then headed to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada for F-86 Sabre training. The F-86 was the first American swept-wing jet fighter, the aircraft that tangled with MiGs over the Yalu River in Korea. And learning to fly it was like being handed the keys to the hottest car on the planet. From December 1954 to February 1955, Collins served with the 3,595th Student Squadron at Nellis, absorbing everything about high-performance jet flying. His next assignment was unexpected but significant. In April of 1955, Quincy Collins was sent to the brand-new United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. The academy had just been established the year before, created by Congress to provide the Air Force with its own service academy like West Point for the Army and Annapolis for the Navy. The first class of cadets arrived in 1955, and there were no upper-class cadets to train them. At established academies, the training of new cadets was primarily the responsibility of upperclassmen who had already been through the system and understood its demands. But the Air Force Academy had no upperclassmen. It was starting from scratch. That job fell to air training officers like First Lieutenant J. Quincy Collins, young officers who would shape the first 3 classes of Air Force Academy cadets. These ATOs came from throughout the Air Force, selected for their leadership potential, their military bearing, their ability to mold young men into officers. It was an honor to be chosen, and a tremendous responsibility. The men they trained would become the foundation of the Air Force Officer Corps for decades to come. Collins wasn't just an ATO, he was also the director of the Protestant Cadet Chapel Choir. One of those early cadets, a young man named Dick Trail, who would later become a KC-135 tanker pilot, remembered Collins decades later in a newspaper column. 6 foot plus, built rugged, he didn't fit the picture of the refined music teacher, Trail wrote. But his obvious love of music and skill at getting them to sing in 4-part harmony made practice and their weekly chapel performances genuinely fun. That musical ability, that gift for organizing people around song, would become critical under circumstances no one could have imagined. Quincy Collins was also keeping his flying skills sharp at the academy, flying F-86Es to maintain proficiency. He served as an ATO until December 1957, training 3 classes of cadets who would go on to serve throughout the Air Force. Many of them would fly combat missions in Vietnam. Some of them would become generals. A few of them would be captured and become prisoners of war themselves. They all carried something of Quincy Collins with them, the lessons he taught, the standards he set, the example of what an Air Force officer should be. These were the foundational years of what would become one of the premier military academies in the world, and Quincy Collins was there from the beginning. After the academy, Collins headed to Europe. From December 1957 to January 1959, he flew F-86 Sabres and F-100 Super Sabres with the 10th Fighter Bomber Squadron of the 50th Fighter Bomber Wing at Toul-Rosières Air Base in France. This was Cold War Europe, NATO bases scattered across the continent, fighter pilots on alert for Soviet aggression. The constant tension of knowing that World War III could begin at any moment. Collins excelled there too, earning recognition for his flying skills and leadership potential. His talent didn't go unnoticed. From January to July 1959, Quincy Collins served as aide to the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, at Wiesbaden, West Germany. That was a 4-star general's aide position, reserved for the most promising young officers. Then, from August 1959 to September 1961, he served as aide-de-camp to the commander of Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. 2 consecutive aide positions to 4-star generals. That told you something about how the Air Force viewed Captain Quincy Collins. He was being groomed for bigger things. After his time as an aide, Collins attended Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama from September 1961 to July 1962. This was professional military education, preparing officers for higher command responsibilities. Then it was back to flying fighters, and this time he was getting into some of the most advanced aircraft the Air Force had. From July 1962 to February 1964, Collins flew F-104 starfighters with the 436th Tactical Fighter Squadron of the 479th Tactical Fighter Wing at George Air Force Base in California. The F-104 was an incredible machine, designed by Kelly Johnson at Lockheed's Skunk Works, nicknamed the Missile with a Man in it because of its tiny wings and phenomenal speed. It could hit Mach 2, climb like a homesick angel, and required constant attention from the pilot because of its handling characteristics. Flying the starfighter made you a better stick. While at George, Collins even earned his parachutist wings at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was a flight commander in the F-104 unit, leading other pilots, building experience that would serve him throughout his career. But the F-104 was a short-range interceptor, not ideal for the strike missions that were becoming increasingly important as the situation in Southeast Asia deteriorated. For that, you needed the F-105 Thunderchief. In February of 1964, Captain Quincy Collins transferred to the 81st Tactical Fighter Squadron of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Itazuki Air Base in Japan. The 81st was called the Headhunters, a nickname that dated back to World War II when the squadron fought in the Pacific. The name came from the New Guinean headhunter tribes who had helped rescue downed American pilots, guiding them back to Allied lines and protecting them from Japanese patrols. Captain Edward Porky Cragg, one of the early squadron commanders, had named the unit to honor those brave tribesmen, and the squadron wore it with pride. A crew chief named Yale Safro, who had turned down a job offer from Walt Disney to stay with the Air Force, designed the original patch. The 81st had a distinguished combat record. They had fought against the Japanese across the Pacific, from Australia to New Guinea to the Philippines to Japan itself. They had transitioned to jet aircraft after the war, flying P-51 Mustangs, then F-80 Shooting Stars, then F-86 Sabres in Korea. By 1956, they were flying F-100 Super Sabres. They had been stationed at various bases across the Pacific, providing air defense for Japan, Korea, and Okinawa. In May 1964, the 81st moved from Itazuke to Yokota Air Base, also in Japan. The squadron had converted to F-105 Thunderchiefs in 1962, trading their F-100 Super Sabres for the biggest, fastest, most powerful single-seat, single-engine fighter ever built. The transition hadn't been easy. The F-105 was a complex aircraft, demanding in terms of maintenance and piloting skills, but it was also incredibly capable. When the headhunters mastered the Thud, they had a weapon that could strike anywhere in the Pacific theater and fight their way back out. The F-105 Thunderchief was designed by Republic Aviation, the same company that built the legendary P-47 Thunderbolt of World War II. Alexander Kartveli, Republic's chief designer, had examined over 100 possible configurations before settling on the final design. The F-105 was originally conceived as a nuclear strike aircraft, designed to fly fast and low into Soviet territory and deliver a single devastating weapon. The internal weapons bay could carry a nuclear bomb, and the entire aircraft was optimized for that single mission. Get in fast, get out faster. Survive to fight another day. But by the mid-1960s, as the Vietnam War escalated, the F-105 had been adapted for conventional bombing, and it turned out to be perfectly suited to the mission. The aircraft could carry more bombs than a World War II B-17 Flying Fortress, over 14,000 pounds of ordnance on external pylons and in an internal weapons bay that could hold either a nuclear weapon or a 390-gallon fuel tank for extended range. It could hit Mach 2 at altitude and exceed the speed of sound at sea level, something very few aircraft of that era could do. The single Pratt & Whitney J75 engine produced more than 24,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner, accelerating that 50,000-pound aircraft with authority that made pilots grin inside their oxygen masks. The cockpit was spacious, with good visibility and a logical instrument layout. The advanced avionics were easy to learn and operate. Takeoffs and landings were performed at around 230 miles per hour, and the spoilers provided excellent roll control at all speeds. The distinctive four-pedal air brakes could be deployed even at supersonic speeds, slowing the aircraft quickly when needed. They called it the thud, partly because of the sound it made when it hit the ground, but also as a term of affection. Other nicknames were less flattering: the squat bomber, the lead sled, the hyper hog. But the pilots who flew the F-105 into combat came to love that airplane. It was big, powerful, responsive, and it could take incredible punishment and keep flying. Stories circulated of thuds returning to base with massive holes in their airframes, with entire sections of wing missing, with damage that should have brought them down but somehow didn't. The aircraft seemed to want to bring its pilots home. The thud would become the workhorse of the air campaign over North Vietnam, flying 75% of all strike sorties during certain periods of the war. When you saw formations of aircraft heading north from Thai bases, they were usually F-105s, loaded with bombs and fuel, ready to take on the most heavily defended targets on Earth. But the thud also paid a terrible price for its courage. More F-105s were lost in Vietnam than any other American aircraft. 382 destroyed in combat and operational accidents, nearly half of the 833 ever built. It was the only American aircraft removed from combat specifically because of its high loss rate. Those numbers testified to the danger of the missions they flew and the effectiveness of North Vietnamese defenses. By the summer of 1965, the 81st Tactical Fighter Squadron was deploying to Thailand for combat operations. The squadron rotated through temporary duty assignments to Korat and Tak Ly, Royal Thai Air Force bases, flying strike missions into North Vietnam as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that began in March 1965, designed to pressure Hanoi into negotiations and disrupt their support for the war in the South. President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara believed they could bomb North Vietnam into submission, that the escalating airstrikes would convince Ho Chi Minh to stop supporting the Viet Cong and come to the negotiating table. They were wrong about that, but the pilots flying the missions didn't get to make policy. They just had to execute it. For F-105 pilots, Rolling Thunder meant long missions over heavily defended territory. A typical strike mission began before dawn, with briefings that covered the target, the threat environment, weather, tanker rendezvous points, and emergency procedures. Then you walked out to your aircraft in the tropical heat of Thailand, climbed into a cockpit that could reach 140 degrees before the air conditioning kicked in, and strapped yourself to an ejection seat. You hoped you wouldn't need it. They would take off from Thailand in formation, climb out over Laos, and rendezvous with KC 135 tankers to top off their fuel tanks. Then they turned northeast, crossed into North Vietnam, and began their descent toward the target. The route packages divided North Vietnam into numbered areas, with Route Package 6 around Hanoi and Haiphong being the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aerial warfare. The North Vietnamese had been studying American tactics, importing Soviet weapons, building integrated air defense networks that combined radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG interceptors. By 1965, they were shooting down American aircraft at an alarming rate. A pilot approaching Hanoi had to contend with everything: flak from small arms and machine guns at low altitude, medium and heavy anti-aircraft fire from guns up to 100 millimeters, SAMs that could reach up to high altitude, and MiGs that prowled the edges, waiting for damaged or separated aircraft. It was the most dangerous flying mission in the world, and Quincy Collins flew into that environment repeatedly, absorbing the lessons, learning the tricks that kept you alive. By August 1965, Quincy Collins was deployed with the 36th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Tak Ly, on temporary duty from his parent unit at Yokota. He had flown multiple missions, attacking targets throughout North Vietnam. He was experienced, competent, the wing weapons officer for his 3-squadron group. He understood the dangers, knew pilots who had been shot down, accepted that every mission could be his last. September 2, 1965, Collins was flying an F-105D Thunderchief, serial number 62-4389, leading a strike against a heavily defended bridge in North Vietnam. It was his 13th mission over the North, a number that would prove unlucky for him. Bridges were critical targets, choke points where supplies from China and the Soviet Union funneled south toward the battlefields. Everything the North Vietnamese army needed to fight in the south came through those bridges: ammunition, weapons, food, fuel, medicine. Destroy the bridges, and you disrupted the flow. Let them stand, and the enemy kept getting stronger. The North Vietnamese knew this and defended their bridges with everything they had: anti-aircraft guns ranging from small arms fire up to heavy 85mm and 100mm cannons, surface-to-air missile sites with Soviet SA-2 guideline missiles that could reach high altitude, fighters on alert at nearby airfields. Attacking a bridge in North Vietnam was one of the most dangerous missions in aviation. The weather was challenging that day: overcast cloud layers, haze, rain showers in the target area. Collins pushed over into his dive, committed to the attack, fighting through the murk to find his target. The sky was filling with anti-aircraft fire, those distinctive gray puffs that looked almost harmless until you flew through them and felt your aircraft shudder from near misses. Every gun in the area was tracking his flight, filling the air with shrapnel that could tear through aluminum skin and hydraulic lines and fuel tanks. He was focused on the target, putting the gun sight pipper where it needed to be, waiting for the right moment to release his bombs. Flying an attack profile in bad weather against a defended target required total concentration, every faculty devoted to the task at hand. And then, his aircraft took a direct hit. The world exploded around him. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. The controls went heavy. Something catastrophic had happened to the airplane. Fire warning, hydraulic failure, flight control degradation. Everything was going wrong at once. His wingman was calling over the radio, urging him to get out, to eject before it was too late. before the aircraft became uncontrollable or exploded. But Quincy Collins didn't punch out immediately. He was a professional, a weapons officer, a man who understood that the mission came first. He continued the attack, kept the aircraft pointed at the target despite the damage, maintained his dive angle and release parameters through sheer skill and willpower. He released his bombs with devastating accuracy, seeing them fall toward the bridge, even as his aircraft screamed its death throes around him. Only after his ordnance was away did he address his own survival. For that action, for pressing the attack in a crippled aircraft, Captain James Q. Collins, Jr. would be awarded the Silver Star for Gallantry in Combat. The citation would read that, despite being urged by his wingman to abandon the aircraft, Captain Collins courageously continued to fly his crippled aircraft toward the target, delivering his bomb load with devastating accuracy. But the Silver Star citation wouldn't capture what happened next. Collins ejected from the dying Thunder Chief at high speed, somewhere around 500 knots. The violence of that ejection was almost beyond description. His helmet was ripped off by the wind blast. His gloves were torn from his hands. The force of the air at that speed forced blood through the pores of his skin. When his parachute opened, he was badly injured before he ever reached the ground. And then things got worse. As Collins descended in his parachute, he could see North Vietnamese soldiers converging on his landing point. There was no rescue coming. Not here, not deep in enemy territory with defenses all around. He landed hard, compounding his injuries. His leg was broken in 3 places. Before he could even begin to assess his situation, armed soldiers were surrounding him, weapons pointed at his chest. Quincy Collins was now a prisoner of war. That was his 13th mission over North Vietnam. He was 34 years old. He would not see American soil again for nearly 8 years. 5 years would pass before he received his first letter from home, a letter from his mother telling him that his father had died. His family had thought him dead. They had held a memorial service, and now, years later, they learned he was alive. The North Vietnamese didn't treat their prisoners well, despite being signatories to the Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment of captured combatants. Collins was dragged along jungle trails, his broken legs screaming with every movement. The break was severe, in 3 places, and without proper medical care it would heal badly, leaving him with lasting disability. But the Vietnamese didn't care about his comfort. They cared about moving him north, away from the combat zone, toward the camps around Hanoi where they held their most valuable prisoners. At one point, Collins and other captured Americans were roped together at the neck and marched north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail toward Hanoi. This was the famous network of paths and roads that connected North Vietnam to the battlefields in the south, winding through Laos and Cambodia, constantly under attack by American aircraft, but constantly repaired and expanded. Now, Collins was walking it in the other direction, a prisoner being marched to captivity. It was hundreds of miles of brutal travel, by foot when they could walk, by truck when the Vietnamese chose to transport them, through jungle and over mountains, held in small cells and caves along the way. The monsoon rains soaked them, the tropical heat exhausted them, and the guards showed no mercy. The journey itself was torture, a preview of what awaited them in Hanoi. When Collins finally arrived at the prison camps around Hanoi, the real ordeal began. The North Vietnamese prison system was designed to break American POWs, to extract propaganda statements condemning the war, to use the prisoners as bargaining chips and tools of psychological warfare. The methods were medieval: rope torture that dislocated shoulders and cut off circulation, beatings with rubber hoses and fists, solitary confinement for months or years at a time, starvation rations that left men skeletal, medical care withheld from the sick and wounded. The goal was rarely to extract military intelligence. Most of the POWs had been pilots, and they didn't know operational plans or strategic secrets. The Vietnamese wanted propaganda, written or recorded statements that criticized American policy and praised their captors. Such statements would be used to sway world opinion against the American war effort. To get those statements, the Vietnamese would torture men until they broke, then use the shame of breaking to further control them. It was a vicious cycle designed to destroy not just bodies, but minds and spirits. The most notorious facility was Hoa Lo Prison in central Hanoi, a French colonial prison built in the 1890s to hold Vietnamese revolutionaries fighting colonial rule. The French had called it Maison Centrale. The Vietnamese called it the Fiery Furnace, Hoa Lo, after the street where stove merchants once sold their wares. American POWs called it the Hanoi Hilton, dark humor in the face of horror, a reference to the famous hotel chain that suggested luxury accommodations rather than torture cells. The cells were tiny, often completely dark, infested with rats and insects. Men were forced to sit or lie on concrete slabs with their legs locked in irons that had been used by the French decades earlier. The irons cut into their legs, causing lacerations and infections. Some prisoners spent years in solitary, their only human contact the guards who brought meager rations or dragged them to interrogation rooms. The prison had its own geography of suffering. Little Vegas was one section, with buildings named after Las Vegas casinos: the Golden Nugget, the Thunderbird, the Stardust, the Riviera, the Desert Inn. The zoo was another camp, the plantation another. Each had its own character, its own guards, its own particular forms of cruelty. Men were transferred between camps, sometimes as punishment, sometimes for propaganda purposes, sometimes for reasons the Vietnamese never explained. Communication was forbidden, punishable by severe torture. But the Americans developed their own systems, most famously the tap code, a matrix of letters that allowed messages to be tapped through walls. One POW named Smitty Harris, an Air Force pilot captured in 1965, remembered the code from survival training and taught it to others. The code spread from cell to cell, building to building, camp to camp, until it became the common language of American prisoners throughout North Vietnam. Through tap code, through hand signals, through notes smuggled in waste buckets, the prisoners maintained their connection to each other. They shared news, passed encouragement, organized resistance, and maintained a chain of command, despite Vietnamese efforts to isolate them. Quincy Collins endured all of it. His leg healed badly without proper medical care. He was tortured for information, for propaganda statements, for signs of weakness that the Vietnamese could exploit. But he never stopped resisting, never stopped looking for ways to maintain his dignity and support his fellow prisoners. On Christmas Eve of 1965, just a few months after his capture, Collins and other POWs were moved to different cells, separated into groups of 1 or 2 men. Communication became even more difficult, more dangerous. The Vietnamese were trying to isolate them, break them down individually, prevent the solidarity that gave them strength. But the Americans found ways to stay connected, tapping through walls, flash hand signals when guards weren't watching, risking severe punishment for even the smallest contact with their fellow prisoners. Eventually, the Vietnamese consolidated prisoners into larger groups, cells with 4 or 5 men. This was partly practical, partly propaganda, allowing them to stage events and photographs showing Americans in apparently acceptable conditions. And it was in this environment that Quincy Collins found his mission: the thing that would define his captivity and cement his place in POW history. The camp commander at one of the facilities called Collins in for a meeting. The Vietnamese had learned that Collins had a musical background, that he had directed choirs at the Air Force Academy, that he could organize men to sing. They wanted him to form a POW choir for a propaganda event. The Vietnamese planned to film a Christmas program, broadcast it to the other prisoners, perhaps use it for international propaganda purposes. They thought they were manipulating Collins. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. Collins asked for time to think about it. Normally, the Vietnamese didn't grant delays, but this time they agreed. Collins immediately began communicating with the senior American officer in his area, a man named Larry Guarino. The communication was agonizingly slow, messages tapped through walls over days, but they developed a plan. If Collins formed the choir, he could use it to communicate with other prisoners, to boost morale, to pass information that the Vietnamese would never suspect. He would request that one man from every building be allowed to participate. Those men could carry messages back and forth, creating a communication network that bypassed the Vietnamese restrictions. Collins went back to the camp commander and agreed to form the choir. The Vietnamese were pleased. They didn't realize they had just handed the Americans a powerful tool of resistance. On Christmas Eve, guards came to each of the choir members, told them to put on their best uniforms, which meant the cleanest of their threadbare prison pajamas with their prisoner numbers on the back. Then, they were handcuffed with their hands behind their backs, blindfolded, and loaded onto a bus. They were chained to the seats to prevent movement. Collins couldn't see, couldn't move his hands, but he started communicating anyway. He bumped his elbow against the man next to him, using the rhythm to tap out messages. He used his foot to tap the ankle of the man in front of him. Even chained and blindfolded on a bus headed to an unknown destination, the Americans were sending and receiving messages, coordinating their resistance. The Vietnamese thought they had the situation under control. They had no idea. They arrived at a facility none of them had ever seen before. The blindfolds and handcuffs were removed, and they were led into a building. Inside was a Christmas tree, decorated in the manner the Vietnamese thought Americans would expect. There was a minister dressed in formal religious garb, though his theology was heavily influenced by communist ideology, comparing Lyndon Johnson to King Herod in his remarks. And there was an audience of American prisoners. About 150 men gathered to hear the performance. Collins later described the scene vividly. As he looked around, he recognized faces. These were men from his own squadron, men who had attended his memorial service back in the States. They thought he was dead. His family had been notified that he was missing in action, and many assumed the worst. Now they were seeing him alive, conducting a choir in a North Vietnamese prison camp. Some of them stared, disbelief written on their faces, probably thinking he had lost his mind or that the Vietnamese had finally broken him. Collins passed the word to his choir members. Communicate. Use tap code if you can. Talk quietly if the guards aren't looking. Pass messages any way you can. Every man in the choir was a conduit to his building, a link in a communication chain that the Vietnamese had unwittingly created. And when it came time for his solo performance of "O Holy Night," Quincy Collins did something that still astonishes people who hear about it. He kept the familiar melody, the tune that everyone recognized, but he improvised new words. The Vietnamese guards were accustomed to the music. They had heard Americans practicing it, but they didn't speak enough English to catch subtle lyrical changes. So Collins sang about the actual situation in the camps. He included coded information about how many prisoners were being held, who was in charge, what conditions were like. He tried to make the new lyrics rhyme, fitting them to the melody, singing intelligence reports disguised as Christmas carols. The men in the audience caught on immediately. They stared at him with expressions that mixed disbelief with admiration, probably thinking he was going to get shot on the spot. Some of them were blinking messages back at him, but the Vietnamese remained oblivious, pleased that their propaganda event was going smoothly, never suspecting that the choir director was passing tactical information right under their noses. The performance ended without incident. The choir was loaded back on the bus, handcuffed and blindfolded again, and returned to their cells. Collins had demonstrated that even in captivity, even under the most restrictive conditions, American ingenuity could find ways to resist. That choir became a permanent feature of life in the prison camps. Collins formed multiple choirs over his years of captivity, used them to maintain morale, to pass information, to remind the men that they were Americans, that they had something worth fighting for. During one of the worst periods, when morale was at its lowest ebb, Collins composed an original hymn. He had no paper, no pen, no musical instruments. He wrote the lyrics on toilet paper, using a fishbone whittled to a fine point as a writing implement. For ink, he used red liquid extracted from a diarrhea pill. The words expressed everything the POWs felt: their longing for home, their faith in their country, their commitment to each other. That hymn would become known as the POW hymn, and it would follow Collins out of captivity and into history. Now, if you're still with me at this point in the story, I want to say something. The stories of Vietnam POWs are some of the most powerful accounts of American resilience ever recorded. These men endured things that most of us can barely imagine, and they did it for years, not knowing if they would ever be released, not knowing if anyone back home even knew they were alive. If you want to help keep these stories in circulation, if you believe that what they went through deserves to be remembered, subscribing to this channel is one way to make that happen. For about a year and a half of his captivity, Quincy Collins shared a cell with a man who would become one of the most famous Americans of his generation, John McCain. The future senator, presidential candidate, and maverick political figure was a Navy pilot shot down over Hanoi in October of 1967. He arrived at the prison camps badly injured, both arms broken, his right leg shattered. The Vietnamese initially withheld medical treatment, nearly killing him, before they realized his father was a high-ranking admiral and decided he was too valuable to let die. McCain and Collins became close during their time together. They developed routines to pass the time, ways to stay sane in conditions designed to drive men crazy. Collins later described how he and McCain became the entertainment in their cell, using humor, storytelling, and sheer stubbornness to maintain their spirits. Music was part of it. Collins would teach songs, lead impromptu performances, use his skills to remind everyone that they were still human beings, still Americans, still capable of beauty and joy even in the worst circumstances. The years ground on: 1966, 1967, 1968. The war escalated, then began to wind down. Peace talks started in Paris, stalled, resumed, stalled again. Inside the camps, the prisoners endured cycles of torture and relative quiet, propaganda campaigns, and periods of neglect. In September 1969, Ho Chi Minh died, and conditions in the camps improved somewhat. The torture becoming less frequent, the food slightly better, the isolation less absolute. Some historians speculate that Ho had personally driven the harsh treatment, and that his successors were less invested in breaking the Americans. Others note that the release of several POWs around that time had exposed the conditions to the world press, creating international pressure on Hanoi. Whatever the reason, the final years of captivity were more bearable than the early ones, though never comfortable, never safe. Quincy Collins spent time at multiple facilities around Hanoi. He was at the zoo, another prison camp with sardonic American nicknames for its various buildings. He was at Camp Faith, where he composed the POW hymn. He was at the Hanoi Hilton itself, the central clearinghouse for American prisoners. Through it all, he maintained his resistance, his dignity, his commitment to his fellow prisoners. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed, ending American involvement in the Vietnam War and providing for the release of all POWs within 60 days. The negotiations had dragged on for years, started and stopped, complicated by military events on the ground and political pressures at home. The Christmas bombing of December 1972, Operation Linebacker II, had finally brought the North Vietnamese back to serious negotiations. American B-52s had pounded Hanoi and Haiphong for 11 days, absorbing losses but demonstrating that the United States could strike anywhere in North Vietnam without restraint. The prisoners in the camps heard those bombs falling, felt the buildings shake, and some of them worried about being killed by their own country's weapons. But they also knew what those bombs meant: pressure on Hanoi to settle, pressure that might finally bring them home. The prisoners knew something was happening in early 1973, but they had been disappointed before, lied to, manipulated. Some had been held for 8 years, since the earliest days of the air campaign. They didn't dare believe it was really over until they saw the evidence with their own eyes. When guards lined them up and told them they would be released, they showed no emotion, refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing their relief. On February 12, 1973, the first C-141 Starlifters, aircraft that would become known as Hanoi Taxis, landed at Gia Lam Airport in Hanoi to begin Operation Homecoming. The prisoners were released in order of capture, with the longest-held men going first. Navy Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez, Jr., captured in August 1964, was among the first to walk to freedom. The scene at Gia Lam was carefully staged, both sides aware that cameras were watching, that history was being recorded. The Americans walked steadily toward the aircraft, some limping on legs that had never healed properly, some gaunt from years of malnutrition, but all of them walking, all of them determined to leave with dignity. Quincy Collins wasn't in the very first group, but he didn't have long to wait. On February 12, 1973, Colonel James Quincy Collins, Jr. walked off a C-141 at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. He had been a prisoner for 2,721 days, nearly 7.5 years. The longest-held Army POW, Floyd James Thompson, had been held for 9 years. Some men had been released earlier as propaganda gestures, but for most, this was the moment they had dreamed about through years of darkness and pain. Quincy Collins was 41 years old, thin, bearing the marks of years of mistreatment, but alive, free, an American again. The first thing the returning POWs did at Clark was receive medical attention and decent food. Many of them gorged themselves on steak and ice cream, things they had fantasized about during years of rice and pumpkin soup. They were given new uniforms, examined by doctors, debriefed by intelligence officers eager to learn what they knew. Then they boarded aircraft for the final leg home, some to bases near their families, some to hospitals for extended treatment. The nation watched their return with a mixture of joy and guilt, celebrating these men while still processing the trauma of a war that had divided the country. The returning POWs were treated as heroes, which they were. President Nixon hosted a dinner at the White House for all 591 of them on May 24, 1973, the largest sit-down dinner in White House history. Nearly 1,300 guests attended, including the POWs, their spouses, members of Congress, cabinet officials, and Vice President Spiro Agnew. The only way to get an invitation was to have been a prisoner of the Vietnam War, an extraordinarily high admission price paid in years of suffering. The entertainment industry rolled out its biggest names to welcome them home. Bob Hope was the master of ceremonies, the comedian who had spent decades visiting troops overseas, now presiding over the celebration of their return. John Wayne was there, the iconic figure of American masculinity who had portrayed countless military heroes on screen, now honoring the real thing. Irving Berlin, Sammy Davis Jr., and other entertainment legends participated. The White House chefs called in reinforcements from restaurants across Washington to prepare roast sirloin, seafood supreme, and strawberry mousse for the 1,300 guests. For Quincy Collins, the most meaningful moment came when he and the other members of his prison choir performed the POW hymn for the gathered dignitaries, families, and fellow veterans. This was the hymn Collins had written on toilet paper with fishbone and diarrhea pill ink, practiced in whispers when guards were away, sung to lift spirits during the darkest days of captivity. Now it was being performed in the White House, broadcast on national television, witnessed by the President of the United States and the nation he served. The choir had practiced only once since their release. Many of them were seeing each other in formal uniforms for the first time, having only known each other as gaunt men in prison pajamas with numbers on their backs. But they knew the words, knew the melody, knew what every line meant because they had lived it. The performance was electrifying. Veterans in the audience wept openly. Even the professional entertainers seemed moved by what they witnessed. Here were 35 men who had written a hymn in captivity, who had practiced it under threat of torture, who had kept it alive through years of imprisonment, now singing it in the most famous house in America. We pledge unswerving faith and loyalty to our cause, to America, and to thee. The words meant more than any speech, any medal, any ceremony. They were proof that the Vietnamese had failed to break these men, that something essential had survived 7.5 years of darkness and emerged into the light. Coming home wasn't easy. Collins returned to a wife who had struggled through nearly 8 years of uncertainty, not knowing for much of that time whether her husband was alive or dead. The families of POWs had faced their own ordeal, years of waiting, of hope and despair, of not knowing whether to move on with their lives or keep waiting for someone who might never return. Many wives had been told their husbands were missing in action, a category that offered neither closure nor certainty. Some had remarried only to learn years later that their first husbands were alive. Others had stayed faithful, turning down opportunities, putting their lives on hold, waiting for news that never came. Collins's marriage couldn't survive what both of them had been through. The man who came home was not the same man who had left. 7.5 years of captivity had changed him in ways that were difficult to express, difficult to understand, difficult to bridge. They divorced, one of many POW marriages that collapsed under the weight of separation and trauma. The statistics were stark. A significant percentage of returned POWs divorced within the first few years of freedom. The shared experience of captivity had bonded them to their fellow prisoners in ways that their families couldn't fully understand, creating a brotherhood that sometimes made reintegration into civilian life difficult. But Quincy Collins didn't let the difficulties defeat him. He was briefly hospitalized at Maxwell Air Force Base to recover from his injuries, undergoing medical treatment for the leg that had healed badly and other health problems accumulated during captivity. Then he was assigned to Dobbins Air Force Base in Georgia, as a special assistant to the commander of the Eastern Air Force Reserve Region. It was a staff position, a way to finish out his career while his body recovered and his mind adjusted to freedom. In May 1974, Colonel Quincy Collins retired from the Air Force after 21 years of service. He had accumulated over 3,000 hours of jet time, earned a command pilot rating, flown every hot jet fighter of his era, the F-86 Sabre, the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-104 Starfighter, the F-105 Thunder Chief. He had earned his parachutist wings at Fort Benning. He had 2 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and numerous other decorations for valor and service. He had trained the first 3 classes of Air Force Academy cadets, served as aide to 2 4-star generals, and survived nearly 8 years as a prisoner of war. Most men would have considered that enough for several lifetimes. Quincy Collins was just getting started on his second act. In 1974, and again in 1976, Collins ran for Congress in Georgia's 7th District. He lost both times, but the campaigns introduced him to political life and public speaking, skills he would use for the rest of his life. He moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where he built a successful career in business. He worked in insurance, served as general sales manager at Arnold Palmer Cadillac for 4.5 years, ran his own marketing firm. Eventually, he found his calling in commercial real estate, becoming a broker and rising to senior vice president at Southern Real Estate in Charlotte. For 22 years, he was one of the top producers in the Charlotte market, earning recognition from the Society of Industrial and Office Realtors. He remarried, finding happiness with Catherine, and together they built a blended family with 6 children and 12 grandchildren. He threw himself into community service with the same energy he had brought to everything else in his life. He served on the boards of countless organizations: the Carolinas Carousel Parade, the Carolinas Concert Association, Friendship Trays, the Mint Museum's Collectors Circle, the Charlotte Museum of History. He was a deacon and Stephen minister at Myers Park Presbyterian Church. He founded the Carolinas Freedom Foundation and served as chairman of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg World War II Memorial Foundation. In 1995, he ran for Charlotte City Council. In 1999, he served as president of the Citadel Alumni Association. General Hugh Shelton, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, asked Collins to serve on the board of the Shelton Leadership Initiative at North Carolina State University. The South Carolina Adjutant General selected him for the South Carolina State Guard Foundation Board. He served on the boards of the USO and Operation Homefront for North Carolina. The governor of North Carolina recognized his contributions to public service with the Order of the Long Leaf Pine, the state's highest civilian award. In 2003, the Charlotte Board of Realtors awarded Collins their Realtor Citizen of the Year Award for his contributions to the community, only the second time in their history they had given that recognition. Quincy Collins never forgot his fellow POWs. He participated in reunions, advocated for veterans' causes, kept the memory of those years alive, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for what they had all endured together. He spoke at events, shared his story, reminded audiences that freedom has a price, and that some men paid that price in blood and years of their lives. He maintained the brotherhood that had been forged in those prison camps, the bonds between men who had tapped messages through walls, shared tiny portions of food, encouraged each other when hope seemed lost, and survived when so many did not. The POW community remained close throughout the decades, holding reunions, staying in touch, supporting each other through the challenges of post-war life. They understood things that civilian friends and even family members couldn't fully grasp. They had seen each other at their lowest moments and their most courageous, had witnessed strength they didn't know humans possessed. That shared experience created connections that lasted a lifetime. In 2013, 40 years after Operation Homecoming, Collins and members of his POW choir gathered at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in California to reprise their performance of the POW hymn. It was May 24th, exactly 40 years to the day since they had performed at the White House. Ross Perot, the billionaire businessman who had championed the POW cause for decades, delivered the keynote address. Video messages from Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger were shown. Many of the original choir members were in their 70s and 80s by then, and some of the original choir members had passed away. The ranks were thinner than they had been in 1973, the hair grayer, the steps a little slower. But the survivors stood together once more and sang the hymn that Collins had composed on toilet paper in a Vietnamese prison cell. The cameras rolled just as they had in 1973, and a new generation witnessed the power of what those men had created. The event was broadcast on C-SPAN, reaching millions of Americans who had been children during the Vietnam War or hadn't been born at all. For many of them, it was their first exposure to the POW experience, their first understanding of what those men had endured and how they had survived. Quincy Collins stood at the front of his choir one more time, leading them in the hymn he had written with fishbone and diarrhea pill ink, and the years fell away. They were young men again, prisoners again, singing together in defiance of everything their captors had done to break them. A few years later, approaching his 90th birthday, Collins sat down to write his memoir. He called it Out of the Blue, a reference to his Air Force career and perhaps to the sudden violence that had changed his life on September 2, 1965. The book recounts his childhood in North Carolina, his years at the Citadel, his Air Force career, his shoot-down and captivity, and his life after the war. It's the story of an American patriot who faced unimaginable circumstances and never gave up. On July 4, 2021, Quincy Collins turned 90 years old. He celebrated surrounded by Catherine, his family, and 70 of his closest friends. He was still living in Charlotte, still active in the community, still telling his story to anyone who wanted to hear it. Communication is the most important thing as a POW, he told an interviewer. That was the lesson that had saved him and so many others, the ability to connect with fellow prisoners, to share information and encouragement, to maintain the bonds of humanity even when everything else was stripped away. And music was his tool of communication, the thing that allowed him to organize resistance and sustain hope in the darkest circumstances. If you've listened this far, if you've followed Quincy Collins from that small town in South Carolina through pilot training, the Air Force Academy, fighter squadrons in Europe and Japan, his shoot-down over North Vietnam, nearly 8 years of captivity, and his remarkable second life in Charlotte, then I want to thank you. These stories matter. They're not just history, they're reminders of what ordinary Americans are capable of when tested beyond anything they could have imagined. The 81st Tactical Fighter Squadron, the Headhunters, flew 7,384 combat missions in Southeast Asia, including over 2,600 directly over North Vietnam. They accumulated more than 17,000 combat hours. Their pilots earned 7 Silver Stars, 64 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 426 Air Medals. Several of them were shot down and never came home. Of those who were captured, Quincy Collins, Murphy Neal Jones, and Don Heiliger returned in 1973. Others, like William V. Frederick and Lynn K. Powell, are listed as killed in action, their remains never recovered. The F-105 Thunder Chief that Quincy Collins flew was one of 382 lost during the war. The aircraft that seemed so invincible on the ground, so powerful and capable, proved vulnerable to the concentrated defenses around Hanoi. But the men who flew them, the Thud pilots who pressed their attacks through walls of flak and SAMs, they demonstrated courage that transcends any single aircraft or mission. Quincy Collins was one of those men. He flew 13 missions before he was shot down, delivered his bombs despite taking a fatal hit to his aircraft, ejected at terrifying speed, and then survived nearly 8 years of captivity through faith, stubbornness, and the power of music. He turned a propaganda opportunity into a resistance network, composed a hymn on toilet paper, and performed it at the White House in front of the president and the nation. He rebuilt his life after the war, became a successful businessman and community leader, raised a family, and never stopped serving. Born on Independence Day, shot down on September 2nd, released on February 12th, died. Actually, as of 2021, Colonel James Quincy Collins was still very much alive, still telling his story, still reminding Americans what freedom costs and what it means to never give up. That's a life worth remembering. That's a story worth telling. If you found value in this, if you want to help keep accounts like this one alive and accessible, subscribing is the best way to support the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every time one of these stories reaches a new person, it honors the men who lived it. There's something about these POW stories that hits different from other war narratives. These weren't just men who faced danger in combat. That's something many veterans experience. These were men who faced captivity, isolation, torture, and years of uncertainty about whether they would ever see home again. They had to find ways to maintain their sanity, their dignity, their sense of self, when everything was designed to break them down. Quincy Collins found his way through music. He took a skill he had developed in peacetime, leading choirs at the Air Force Academy and singing in church as a boy, and transformed it into a weapon of resistance. He used Christmas carols to pass intelligence. He composed hymns to sustain hope. He organized performances that reminded 500 men that they were still Americans, still brothers, still part of something larger than their individual suffering. Communication is the most important thing as a POW. That's what Collins said, and that's what he proved through 7.5 years of captivity. The tap code, the hand signals, the smuggled messages, the choir performances, all of it was about maintaining connection, about refusing to let the Vietnamese isolate and break them as individuals. As long as they could communicate, they could resist. As long as they could resist, they could maintain their dignity. And as long as they maintained their dignity, they could survive. Quincy Collins survived. He came home, rebuilt his life, found love again, served his community, wrote his memoir, and lived to see his 90th birthday celebrated by family and friends. He outlived Ho Chi Minh, outlived the communist government's hopes of breaking American prisoners, outlived most of the men who had guarded and tortured him in those prison camps around Hanoi, and he never stopped singing. From the Protestant Cadet Chapel at the Air Force Academy to the Christmas Eve performance in a North Vietnamese prison camp, to the White House dinner in 1973, to the Nixon Library reunion in 2013, Quincy Collins kept forming choirs, kept making music, kept using song to bring people together and remind them of what matters. That's not something you can fake. That's not something you can train. It comes from somewhere deeper, from a faith in humanity and country that even 7.5 years of captivity couldn't destroy. Colonel James Quincy Collins, Jr., United States Air Force retired, prisoner of war, choir director, businessman, community leader, husband, father, grandfather, American patriot. Thank you for your service, thank you for your sacrifice, and thank you for letting your story be told.